corner, there's a speaker view or panel view. And if you pop it onto speaker view, whoever's speaking, you'll be able to see their face, the biggest, because there's a lot of panel members here today. If everybody's video and audio is turned off, you can only see the panel members. But if you'd like to pose a question, you can do so in the Q&A box. And at the very end, we'll hopefully collect all those questions and be able to pose them back to the panel members. And if you have any difficulties, you can email me in at cpd@socialcareireland.ie, and hopefully I'll be able to answer any of those queries. So today, the run-up today is that Deirdre Connolly from HICWA is going to give a presentation, and then Mary is our chair, is going to direct a couple of questions to each panel member. And like I said, at the end, we are going to pick out some questions from that question and answers box and pose them back to the panel members. So I'd like to just introduce Mary McCarran, who is a professor in Ageing and Intellectual Disabilities in Trinity College, Dublin. She's also a committed research lead and an international speaker on intellectual disabilities, aging, dementia, and end-of-life care. And she's also a founder and principal investigator in the first ever longitudinal comparative study for aging of persons with intellectual disabilities in Ireland and internationally. And that's the IDS TILDA study. So like I said, Mary is going to chair today's panel discussion, and she's going to introduce each panel member and then pose some questions and give each panel member to answer those questions first. And then at the very end, we will hopefully be able to answer any of your questions. So I'll pass over now to Mary. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone. I know there's participants are currently joining, and well, congratulations to Charlotte and to Social Care Ireland for organising this, what is, I think, a very timely and critical seminar or webinar, particularly in the light of everything that's currently happening. And certainly, you know, people working on the front line, I think it is a very challenging time. It's also a very challenging time for people who are in need or receipt of care. And I think what we're trying to do is to all really work together and to ensure that we are able to assess risk, and that we also understand how to do this in a way that still upholds the rights and human respect and dignity of everyone that we are supporting. And I think we're very lucky to have a wonderful panel of experts here with us this morning, I suppose, to assist all of us in trying to answer and find our way during this very uncertain period of time. Just to, as Charlotte has said, there is, if you have questions, a number of questions have already been submitted by participants, and I will direct these to the panel members later on. But if you have any additional questions, can you put them into the question and answer facility? It's at the bottom of your bar, rather than the chat box. If you want to say hello, use the chat box, but if you have questions, if you can put them into the question and answer box. Later on, when we move to the panel discussion, I will introduce the panel members, but I really firstly want to introduce our keynote speaker for this morning, which is Deirdre Connolly. And Deirdre works with HICWA and has done incredible work around developing national standards and guidance for health and social care services. And many of you will be aware that Deirdre has led on the development of the national standards for adult safeguarding, as well as the national standards for children's residential centres. And Deirdre now is currently leading the development of new standards focused on the care and support of children and the health and social care system. So we're delighted to have Deirdre with us this morning to share and to help us unravel and unwrap what all of this means. So I'm just going to hand over to Deirdre, and Deirdre will now share her screen and put up a brief presentation. And just to say to people, well, you can see us hopefully and hear us, we can't actually see or hear you, so you're okay.
Thanks so much, Mary, for that introduction. I'm going to share my screen just to say, and I'm sure everybody's been in this position, this technologically we've had some challenges over the past while, so we're just coming to terms with all of these things. So I'm sure everybody's feeling the same about it. So if you're seeing notes and whatnot, then don't worry about it. So yes, this is not the one I was looking to. Here we go, starting as we mean to go on. But look, we can use this one anyway. And if you just want to, I'll have the presentation, and you can use the sidebar to cover over the notes for the for these, or the next screen on. So as Mary said, my name is Deirdre Conley, and I work for HICWA in the standards development arena. I worked for a long time in frontline services, in homeless services, in disability services, and before I came to HICWA. So I'm a social care practitioner, and I just completed my master's in social care leadership and management as well. So I suppose I've experienced those frontline concerns. I haven't been there for the pandemic, so I respect that it's very different.
Sorry, Deirdre, can you just use your slide show? It's just not on full screen. Yeah.
Hopefully that will that work? Oh, perfect. Thanks so much, Mary. That's brilliant.
Sorry.
I've learned something already today. So I suppose, first of all, I just want to say thank you for the opportunity to talk here today about, the balancing risk and positive risk taking and person-centered planning in a time of extremely high risk. And I suppose I would just like to acknowledge that you, as social care practitioners, as social workers, as people working at the front line or in management of people at the front line, you're taking unprecedented risks that other people in society aren't necessarily experiencing. And I think that really needs to be acknowledged. And naturally, there's a sense that, we need to minimize risk. We need to focus on what we need to do to protect people. And I think that's inevitable in such an uncertain time, in such a just really unforeseen kind of situation. But I suppose now we have a chance to look more broadly back at what has happened and what is going to happen in the coming months and potentially years, and the impact of that on people and on how we kind of respond to that. So there's a chance, I suppose, to take a bit of a breath and get a bit of perspective on what's going on today. And I think it's a lovely opportunity. I have a very short presentation. I've got some kind of standard stuff, but also, some kind of stuff specifically around the national standards for adult safeguarding. And happy to take questions about the standards and putting them into practice as well. So I suppose when the Health Information and Quality Authority, people be aware of our role. It's an independent organisation, and we set standards, we monitor and inspect services, we provide guidance, and we carry out health technology assessments. So we've a very wide range of functions. But one of our key responsibilities is to set standards for the sector and to support services to think about how to implement those. So that's very much part of my role. Looking at how we can make the best standards possible and how we can support services to put them into practice, and then monitor how they're actually working in practice. So what's the purpose of standards, I suppose? They set out what people who use services should experiences and how services can demonstrate that they've met these standards. That's kind of what we understand a standard to be. They are a key driver in quality and safety, and they can show what good looks like in practice, in theory and into practice, and can help to address poor performance. But to acknowledge can't do that on their own. Standards can't do that in and of themselves. It's about how they're put into practice, how they're understood and interpreted, how they're kind of lived out by trained staff and by the people who are using the services. And they also are impacted by policy and practice on the ground. So they fit within a framework of a wider framework. So they can't do that on their own, but they are part of an overall system. They promote up-to-date practice, and they are informed by up-to-date practice as well. But you need that wider framework to see them within. So I suppose when we think about standards, we thought about these national standards for adult safeguarding. Up to that point, we've been writing standards specifically for maybe, a sector. So like for disability services or older people services or better healthcare. These ones are an overarching set of standards for adult safeguarding. They apply regardless of where the person is at, what service they're using. So they were developed in partnership with the Mental Health Commission, and I suppose we wanted to focus attention on the area of adult safeguarding because it had come up in a number of reports from HICWA and the Mental Health Commission and through Safeguarding Ireland and the HSE, that there were issues around safeguarding, about the understanding of what safeguarding was, you know, recognising issues that actually were safeguarding issues out there for services and staff on the ground, not really being fully understanding what they were, what those safeguarding issues were. So I suppose we saw an opportunity to address that deficit. So we undertook an international and national review of literature, academic and good practice, and engaged extensively with stakeholders in the area, people using services, family members, advocates, frontline staff, policymakers, and people who are here today might have been part of that engagement, which is, and I know people here on the panel today certainly have, Tim and Patricia have been, and Charlotte have been involved all the way through that, and Louise. So, you know, it's an area that we would have had extensive engagement with. And we launched in 2019, we launched the new standards in 2019, and we have a new digital support learning module, which is due out next month, which will work alongside the HSE safeguarding module, which has just been launched as well, which is great. So I suppose that's where they came from. They came from a need. And when we looked at the evidence, I suppose what we saw was, you know, there was a very strong focus on proportionality, on prevention, on empowerment, around balanced decisions on risks, and a human rights-based approach to safeguarding. And I suppose what we'd seen a move away from, which had been a very strong feature, was a kind of a more paternalistic approach to safeguarding people who were using health and social care services, a move away from those restrictive practices that impacted on their lives, on people's lives, and which were sometimes very obvious and sometimes weren't quite so well seen. And that more bureaucratic end of form filling and risk assessment in a very formalized way, they were still required, but also that's a live and dynamic kind of focus on safeguarding and people's rights and health and well-being as well. So that was the kind of findings from the international review and the national review and some of the stakeholder feedback. And I suppose when we spoke to stakeholders, and I say we had very extensive engagement with focus groups and consultation sessions and public consultation, I suppose the feedback we got was, you know, relationships are the first and most important thing in a service. Like listening to a person, being there for them, supporting them to make decisions that are right for them, and being an advocate. The will and preference of the person and the capacity to make decisions all need to be taken into consideration. And focusing on prevention being a key, and having a relationship-based approach to working with people, and recognizing that alone the standards weren't going to have an impact. They needed to be backed up by legislation, awareness raising, learning and development. And I know Patricia's going to talk about that legislative approach, and Tim will be talking somewhat about that, you know, awareness raising and training. So we recognize that they were part of a bigger picture, I suppose, part of that bigger picture. That was the feedback that we heard and we incorporated into the standards themselves. So I suppose what we came to was 6 principles that underpinned a way of safeguarding, a way of working in safeguarding, an approach that anybody could take on. And those safeguarding principles are 6 principles. They're the principle of empowerment, a rights-based approach, working in partnership, proportionality, prevention, and accountability. And I suppose we don't see any of these principles in isolation. These are interlinked principles, and that they can be used regardless of the context that the person is in, regardless of their particular needs, and that they're cross-cutting, that they recognize people move through and out of services, and that they can be applied at any point in those services. So they kind of frame a way of thinking, and they can be, you know, used to kind of critically inform decisions at a service level, but also at an individual level with the person. So I suppose what we've done in this particular slide is trying to bring them back down to how you or I, as a staff member, live these principles out. You know, you support people to direct their own lives and make their decisions in empowerment. You understand people's rights, and you work in a way that supports them. You work in partnership with the person. You take a proportionate approach when there is a risk, and you take, you know, you take the best action that you need to, but ensuring that the person still has a full life and the impact of the harm is minimized So that prevention is, I suppose, it's a key one. It's about thinking before anything ever happens about how can we set a service up that promotes people's rights, health and well-being and reduces the risk of harm. So you're never getting to that safeguarding place, you know, you're hopefully never getting there, but accepting that that sometimes happens, you know, it's outside of services control. And then that accountability, I suppose this is a very strong one for the sector, is that you and, you know, those you work with are open and you take responsibility for how safeguarding concerns are responded to and managed. And that goes all the way through the organisation. That's accountability at a senior management level, but also at an individual level in working with a person and working within a kind of a service. So those 6 safeguarding principles, I suppose, you know, as I say, they're interlinked and they can guide any kind of discussion or decision. And they can be dialed up and dialed down depending on the situation about how much detail you need to go into about them. But I suppose if we're thinking all the time about, you know, today's topic is about risk-based or risk assessments in a time of crisis, going back to these fundamental principles helps to kind of focus that conversation and those decisions all the time, and going back to them and saying, are we actually doing that? And helps to have that conversation and to have it openly and to see what is the effect on the person. So they're the kind of the 6 principles that we looked at. And I suppose in the standards, I'm just looking at some, maybe what do those principles look like in action. So there's 8 themes within the standards framework, and 4 of them focus on, you know, quality and safety, about the person, and the others about capacity and capability of the organisation. And there's all of them focus in on promoting people's rights, health and well-being. But I suppose pulling these out just as examples, you know, in person-centred care, each person is supposed to engage in shared decision-making about their care and support to reduce the risk of harm and promote their rights, health and well-being. In effective care, we reiterate that and we say that, you know, the service effectively plans and delivers care and support to reduce the risk and promote each person's rights, health and well-being. And then that's backed up by when there is an issue or there's a safety concern, a safeguarding concern, the service strives to protect each person from the risk of harm to promote their safety and welfare. So, you know, these are also interlinked with each other. One doesn't happen discreetly from another. And I suppose at a leadership, governance and management level, and that's, I'd say, a senior level, but also within a service, a specific service, or even within your own team, you know, the service strives to improve the quality of care and support it provides to reduce those risks, but also to promote people's rights, health and well-being. So we're always talking about promoting people's rights, health and well-being and balancing that out with reducing risk, you know, that might occur. So I suppose it's important in any risk assessment that those principles in any of those situations, safety or risk assessment or planning for somebody's care and support, in an individual or a kind of a greater good way as well within a service, that, you know, that those principles of partnership, proportionality, prevention and accountability are, you can see them very strongly there, and they're all within a frame of a rights-based approach to the person's care and support. So that's a very quick run through the kind of the principles and the framework within the standards and where we came to. I suppose what we wanted to make sure as well is that the standards document isn't just a document, it's a live kind of piece of support that, or piece of tool for people to use within their services. We've developed an e-learning module, which will, as I say, will be launching in October, the National Standards for Adult Safeguarding, putting standards into practice. And this really focuses in on, you know, practical examples of how you can put the standards into practice using scenarios, using videos. So we have some videos from people who've used services and people who've delivered services as well, talking about their experience of safeguarding and promoting people's rights, health and well-being. And as I say, we'll be launching that in October for anybody who's working in the sector. So I suppose we were very keen to provide support tools to people, recognizing that sometimes, you know, the standards themselves can feel like they're for management. They're not, but, you know, we try to bring people's experiences in there, you know, people using services experience in there, but, you know, recognizing that something more kind of short, sharp and kind of interactive might be helpful as well. So there's a lot of quizzes and interactivity within the e-learning module. Other kind of support tools that we had developed, again, to make them live for people was a a guide for people using services about, you know, their entitlements around and their you know, around safeguarding or their support their rights. It's just a very little animation that we have developed and which we've used a number of times, which is very helpful for people, you know, to even use when working with people using services. And then I suppose the other major piece of work we've done is guidance on a human rights-based approach to health and social care services. So again, supporting a way of working around a rights-based approach to care and support people. And we worked with Safeguarding Ireland on the development of that that module, or that guidance piece. That's it. That's a very quick whistle-stop tour through our process, and I suppose we have our contact details there, and we have the links to the standards themselves as well, and all the support material that goes with that. So we're very open to people contacting us, or, you know, following up with finding material on that as well. So thank you for your time.
Okay, thank you, Deirdre. Excellent. Thank you, Deirdre. That was really fantastic and really great to see, you know, an online module now being developed to support people as well, to really engage fully with the standards and to understand them. I think a really great presentation and really informative and you know, just a very common sense way of as well trying to understand concepts that might seem maybe complex or a different language to people as well, but I think they're beautifully done and put together. So congratulations on that, and I think the learning module will be just so helpful. Will be just so helpful to people. I'm not sure if we have lost Tim, one of our participants. Hopefully he will come back, but nonetheless, I'm going to rock on with some of the questions in the interest of time. And Deirdre, I know you're just after giving a presentation, but I probably will follow on with one or two direct questions to that. But in the meantime, I'm just going to introduce, while we're waiting on Tim hopefully to come back, our other panel members. And just in the way that they're facing me and looking at me, I'll introduce Patricia Richard Clark, and I think Patricia is probably very familiar to many people. She has done amazing work in this area. She's a solicitor and former commissioner of the Law Reform Commission, and she's the independent chair of Safeguarding Ireland and chair of SAGE Advocacy. And she's a member of the HSE's National Decision Making Capacity Act Steering Group and preparing for the implementation of Assisted Decision Making Act 2015. And I know I've heard Patricia speak many a time and always find her intriguing. So I'm looking forward to Patricia's contribution. I'll just introduce quickly Louise. Louise McLaughlin is the National Manager of the National Advocacy Service for People with Disabilities, and she oversees the patient advocacy services, which is delivered by the National Advocacy Services. And Louise is also a qualified solicitor in Scots law and has expertise in the area of advocacy and rights for people with disabilities. We welcome Tim back. Tim disappeared there for a few moments, but we welcome Tim back. And Tim is the General Manager of the National Safeguarding Office, and we're really delighted to have Tim join us. And he has been a principal social worker with the HSE National Safeguarding Committee, and he's now, as I said, General Manager of the office. And he plays a key role in supporting the implementation of safeguarding vulnerable persons at risk of abuse policy. So that is really good. And finally, we have Marie Tagg, and Marie is Project Manager with the HSE National Office for Human Rights and Equality Policy. And Marie's major areas of responsibility include the vision and oversight of the HSE National Consent Policy, the Do Not Attempt to Resuscitate Policy, Advanced Care Planning, and Advanced Healthcare Directives. And so we have a very experienced group of people here, so this is really good. Deirdre, just following up on your presentation, and a question that has come in, you know, how can the standards, or how do you see now the standards supporting people using health and social care to take positive risks, because that is the issue, is really is about positive risk taking. And I know you talked about proportionality and many of the other principles. So you might talk a little bit to us about that.
Yeah, thanks, Mary. I suppose the way we see it is that, you know, when somebody's using a health and social care service, their rights, you know, to take a risk are not diminished. You know, that just by dint of using a service, it doesn't diminish somebody's rights to, you know, to take a positive risk, or to take, I mean, positive risk always implies a negative. And I suppose it's about taking actions that are important to their lives. So I suppose it's about having that open and frank conversation from the very beginning. And that's part of the culture of a service. It's about a way a service works. It's about how they think about the people using the service. There's been a natural inclination, as I said at the beginning, during the pandemic, to take a medical model, to move towards that medical model. And, you know, that's natural. We've had public health guidance, we've had public health staff, and, you know, we're all kind of armchair epidemiologists at this stage. But I suppose the reality is we come from a social care background with a health background obviously as well, but we want to look at that social model as well, about thinking about the person beyond their presenting need, beyond their presenting limits potentially, and think about that whole person. So I suppose it's about seeing what's, you know, proportionate to the situation, what's proportionate to the person, and how you can support that. I suppose we always think about how you start with a yes, and then you work your way back to how you're going to do that. If you start with a no, then you're potentially never going to get to a yes. So I suppose using the standards and using people's experience on the ground is really, the standards act as a framework. They support people to say, yes, this is good practice, and they don't provide a checklist, or, you know, they're not prescribed kind of standards. They're a way of stretching services to think about it and to say, that's actually what we could do. So in a very broad sense, I think they're very helpful, and it's about how people live them out in their day-to-day practice.
Yeah, I think that's very helpful, Deirdre. And I suppose people are concerned about, you know, maybe somebody wants to take a risk, and the staff member may think that risk is not in their best interest, perhaps. And these are the conversations that people often have. So particularly in the current pandemic situation. So it is managing that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I suppose what the HICWA would have seen, and all the sector would have seen, is that, you know, people have been very much impacted by some of the decisions that have been made around relatives visiting or human contact, and it's been hugely impactful on people, and there's a total understanding of why that would have happened in a first instance. But lots of services have been very creative around how they've done that and how they can support somebody to have something that they really need, and there's a level of risk involved in that, but thinking through how to minimize the impact of that, but how to make those things happen so that other needs are balanced, you know, within that kind of context.
Yeah, I think that's really very important. Yeah, particularly around things like visiting and family, and I think services have been creative and using technology and being pushed into use technology, yeah. But also, you know, supporting the person perhaps who wants to come to visit to assess their own risk as well as the risk for the individual as well. So I think it is about balancing that. And a final question, Deirdre, and I think you might be the person to answer. Do you think that legislation is required to support the adult safeguarding in Ireland?
We submitted, HICWA submitted to the Law Reform Commission the recent submission on developing Adult Safeguarding Act, or legislation rather. And I suppose what we would have said is that we think it's important that there's a framework. You know, that this, you know, the standards are part, as I said, a part of a wider kind of policy context, policy and practice context. And I think there's a real opportunity to support that kind of, you know, the strengthening of that and raising awareness. I suppose the standards came, you know, at a certain time in that process, and we're keen to see, you know, with that legislation, how that can support people to have the best life possible. So, you know, we're keen to see what happens with that. So that submission went in earlier this year, I think. I can't remember now, Patricia. Earlier this year, and we're keen to see what the outcome of that is. So I'm looking forward to hear what Patricia's is kind of views on this is as well.
Okay, well, I just might ask Patricia, perhaps just at this stage, do you want to respond to that there, Patricia? You're on silent at the moment.
Yeah, sorry. Yes, really, I was going to mention adult safeguarding as a huge gap in our legislation. And we have no legal framework to deal with anybody over the age of 18 years of age who is at risk. So huge questions arise. The point that with no regulatory framework, for example, if you take the recent COVID issue, where we had huge individual issues around the care of people or the abuse of people's rights, there's no independent authority, and HICWA doesn't have that function. It doesn't have that statutory function. It looks at the regulation and it looks at systemic issues and organisations, but it doesn't have a role in relation to an individual. So that's a major gap in the legislation. The Law Reform Commission is, in its 5th programme, looking at the whole question of the regulation of adult safeguarding. So it is looking at having that independent statutory authority that one can then report to, and that will actually, I suppose, lead in formulating that framework. So you have issue, I'll come to the adult, when I'm talking, I'll deal with other issues. But certainly for people at risk, an adult, if we take the Grace case, when she reached age 18, where was the legal framework to keep her safe and protect her? There was none. So we have a huge gap in adult safeguarding legislation.
Okay, thank you very much, Patricia. And I know we'll come back to further questions around this topic with you in a few moments. Yes, so thank you for that. Okay, Tim, I'm going to a couple of questions that have come in that I want to perhaps, and it's really following on from the earlier conversation, but really it is again around the impact of the current pandemic on safeguarding and work approaches. And, you know, is there anything that you can add to this or from your perspective?
Well, thanks very much, Mary, for the question, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to be on this webinar, and to Charlotte and Social Care Ireland for organising it. I think the question you've asked there is around what can we add, or what can we do better around the impact of safeguarding. So first of all, to acknowledge, we've come through an horrendous number of months. It's been very, very challenging. A time of great anxiety and huge change. So I'd like to acknowledge the efforts, commitment. So we all have to make big changes in our home life, and then going into work. And I live in a home where I'm a social care worker and a frontline nurse working. I know how difficult it is to make restrictions work at home and then to make them work in the workplace. I suppose since mid-March, and the huge impact that COVID-19 has had on it, and those of us that work in the area of safeguarding full-time, and everybody has a part and act to play safeguarding is everybody's business. I suppose we're just touching on there. Kind of time now maybe to take a step back and look, and maybe ask some key questions. And we touched there on about question risk averse and how we continue to empower and create autonomy for people. So we've seen, for example, the restrictions, how much that impacted on older people's lives. And with quite a blunt instrument, a very necessary public health measure. But now we need to stand back and look at, you know, the visiting restrictions, etc. And I think looking at a risk assessment, people have talked there and sort of touched on proportionality and looking at, you know, the rationale for decisions. So if we take one example, for example, where guidelines and directives come down, through our supervision, through team meetings, looking at how we apply those, looking at how individual decisions are made in people's care plans or in people's protection plans, and having critical debates in between, also listening to families and advocates as well on their perspective. So guidelines have been quite prescriptive. I think now we have an opportunity to kind of look at it more proportionately. More, if you look at now the way we've looked at the second round of restrictions have been more targeted, might kind of be more clearer. So we should never lose our ability to be compassionate and our eye on autonomy of people and the people living valued lives. We need to have that debate, right down to individual questions, right down to individual care planning decisions, and any restrictions that have been put in place for a safeguarding plan, etc. So I think we should be always having those questions every opportunity.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly, you know, the whole issue, you have spoken a little bit about it there, about the impact of cocooning and on those restrictions. And it is about really, I think, Tim, what you're saying, and Deirdre has also said, is very much around looking at the individual on a case-by-case basis and using a very much a person-centered approach, and looking and really understanding the person and understanding the level of distress, and looking at those issues, and looking to see, you know, how can we, you know, implement, you know, do something for this individual that doesn't expose extreme risk, but nonetheless, you know, addresses the distress that these restrictions is currently perhaps placing in the person in the most humane and person-centered approach that we can. Yeah.
I mean, services were reorientated overnight. Huge number of services were constrained, shut, changed. We had to look at new ways of working in an extremely short period of time, very quite restrictive measures. I think we have to ask and question how, as we move forward in a more individualized way, it's not public health measures were very necessary, but we actually now need to look and consider each decision making and its merit, and reevaluate the kind of necessity, because we're quite restrictive and it has quite an impact. And I touched on how much that impacted on people's lives and for individual workers working in service.
And did you see, Tim, that there were particular risk issues that were most noticeable? Did certain things stand out as being most noticeable, or more noticeable than others?
Absolutely. I mean, we're gathering an emerging picture over the last number of months since March. Certainly areas that we have seen, and from our contacts, for example, with domestic violence services, Garda Síochána, talking to service users, talking to people, social care workers, social workers. Certainly, the whole area of domestic violence has been a real concern. It's been concerned for a couple of reasons. One is that people have been restricted in their own homes, the eyes and ears of family members, other members of the community and professionals, where the capacity of people to access service. So that's been a huge issue. I suppose also we've seen concern around financial abuse, well-meaning agency arrangements, well-meaning third-party banking arrangements. However, they carry a risk, that people lose their own power and autonomy to manage their own financial affairs. But also, I mean, I know myself being involved in a local community group, fantastic work done with PA and community organisations. However, some people were, I suppose we need to be mindful that the arrangements need to be as short as period as possible. We need to, you know, as soon as people, and should only be used where absolutely necessary. I think the other area we've seen, interestingly, has been online abuse. Has been a growth, everything from scams to made crime, exploitation online. So, and another area I suppose that we're mindful of is that relationship between stress, conflict, family, home, where people are in caring roles. Be very mindful that people have not had, in some instances, day services, and some of their services have been disrupted. There's been new ways of working. It's been a horrendously difficult time for family care. People care from older people chosen not to allow carers into their home. Some situations where care had to be reorientated. So, you know, we be mindful of not labeling anybody, also mindful that lack of resource and support can lead to people in difficult, stressful situations. So there's been a variety of impact. I think one of the things, though, is now we have an opportunity to learn from the last 6 months. And we certainly learned about new technology, new ways of working. I think we've got to take some of those learnings and messages forward, and look at the kind of consequences, or maybe unintended consequences, of what has been at play here and how it has worked its way out.
Yeah, great, Tim. That's very helpful. And I think learning from the last 6 months, and I think now as we begin to reopen up, and there is an opportunity for us as well to perhaps build back better. And I think, so there is some positives in that way as well, that it has pushed us perhaps to operationalize some of the policies and strategies that we have had there for a long time. Like if we look at something like New Directions, perhaps, and I know from my interviewing of people with disability, some of them actually liked some parts of the new way of the new way of living, and it is absolutely listening to that voice, and it is an opportunity for us all to reflect, and I think it perhaps pushed things like social care much further ahead than we probably would have ever been if this didn't happen. So there's a real opportunity.
And it has forced us to look at more individualized way of working. Some people have really embraced technology. For others, it's been a real difficulty. I mean, we're very mindful about staff and advocates accessing people in residential and congregated settings. Certainly, it has been a push to look at it. And I think one very important thing that has happened, it has pushed forward the debate about what care model in the future. I mean, if we owe it to the people who've made the sacrifices, who have died, the carers that have impacted by this, is need now to push forward that debate.
Yeah,
It's centrally in the political agenda. What kind of care continuum in Ireland do we have? And Patricia touched there on the need for legislative reform. We now have an opportunity to say this is really, really important. We can't wait for the years for the full implementation of ATM. We can't wait for the housing care models for older people with disabilities. Actually, we need to action it now. So I think there is a momentum there now. Let's hope it will continue.
Yeah, absolutely. I know from data from IBS Tilda for years, we were talking about the fact that the technology era appeared to bypass people who were older with an intellectual disability. And so many of them just didn't have access to things like technology, or had limited understanding or opportunity. And, I'm so pleased personally to see now, iPads being brought into areas and people having their own access. And I know at the Dorset Charity Disability Service we were involved in, we got in a project a number of years ago. We had about 80 to 100 people using their own personal iPads to build life story. And you were really trying to change the culture and get people involved in all of this. And now I think it's so much easier to bring in some of these technologies, because it has just been, the culture has just moved, and the pandemic.
Yeah, I think you're right, Mary. I mean,
things on.
Yeah, the message I've been getting is telehealth, remote working, and use of new technology has a place. It can never replace human relationships. However, when I talk to my colleagues in mental health, one of the things they've told me, particularly those in the recovery model, is for some people who have experienced mental health, they actually like engagement at home, in their own place, in their own, not having to physically go into a clinic. For some people has been something they felt empowered. Others haven't welcomed it as much. I think it's about applying it in the right way, in the right setting.
Exactly. No, thank you. Yes, we could continue this conversation, but I have some questions here that I want to also to give to Patricia. And again, Patricia, come back to your earlier point, question on what do you see as the main legislative gaps with regard to person-centred care? And it's just probably picking up on your previous response.
Yes, well, there are a number of issues, and I suppose in terms of legislation, we have enacted legislation but haven't commenced legislation, which is a huge issue. Also, we have legislation but actually don't fully understand it. So there are a number of issues that we have to really be aware of, and I think COVID highlighted many things, but it certainly highlighted how we, whether we have a legal framework or not, and the huge gaps that are there, but also in terms how we apply that legislation in practice. So there are issues. So if we look at the first major piece of legislation, as we all know, which actually the core principle of which is to respect a person as an individual human being with individual rights. And that is the Assisted Decision Making Capacity Act, which was enacted in 2015, and we are now 2020, and it has not yet been fully commenced. That act, of course, the fundamental issue of, I suppose, person-centred care is to know what the views of the person is in relation to consenting to, refusing to, their wishes, how they should be cared for, or whatever. So we need to absolutely understand how we assess a person's capacity. First of all, to presume that a person has capacity. We must assess capacity properly, and we should be following that act even now. The human rights-based approach document that Deirdre referred to says that we should follow the principles in the act even now. And I know some people are following them, but in many cases, and particularly during COVID, actually people made decisions on behalf of people, and the Department of Health actually had to issue a guidance that actually it was really important to take the will and preference of the person into account and to deal with them in their individual circumstances. So that huge gap, as I call it, in the commencement of the legislation is a major issue. The other thing that the Act provides is that there shall be no intervention unless it is necessary to do so, having regard to the individual circumstances. That Act particularly emphasises, coming back to the capacity issue, the need to support a person to maximise their capacity, and also the need, and indeed in the standards and the regulations, it provides for independent advocacy. And we're coming across many cases where people do not have necessarily family support, or if they do, it may not be appropriate family or friendly support, and certainly it's not independent of the service provider. So that Act is key, and I noticed that the expert panel actually in their recommendation recommended two things in relation to that Act: that straight away within 6 months, the capacity sections or part should be fully commenced, and also the part on advanced healthcare directives. As we know, we have the legal framework for advanced healthcare directives set out in detail in that. And again, the Department of Health had to come back in terms of some of their guidelines to highlight the whole question of the right of a person to say what treatment they required or they could refuse. So the fact that we haven't got that Act up and running in place is a huge issue. The next issue then is what we call the protection of liberty safeguards. And in spite of our very clear constitutional provision that no person shall be deprived of their liberty save in accordance with law, we continue to actually put people into places, particularly people with a disability and particularly older people who are old and frail, without any appropriate legal process to do that. We're in breach of the European Convention of Human Rights in relation to that, detaining a person without their consent. Work has been done by the Department of Health over the last 3 years, but we haven't yet seen a developed statutory framework. And I notice in the legislative programme that was published last week, it does provide for protection of liberty safeguard legislation. But again, it's a major gap in the infringement of a person's individual rights. So we need that legislation. As a matter of interest, Safeguarding Ireland did a Red C poll at the beginning of this year. And believe it or not, 58% of the population believe that a family member or a friend has the authority to make decisions in relation to a place of care for another person, for a person who has capacity without their consent. So where does that leave the people who are extremely vulnerable, who don't have capacity? So we have huge issues to deal with. The AC case then pointed out clearly, the AC case is the court case last year in the Supreme Court. It pointed out that a benevolent or protective motivation cannot be considered to alter the legal fact of detention, and that people, either organisations or people, cannot act as substitute decision makers in relation to place of care decisions. So again, the courts are saying very clearly that we actually need that legal framework. Moving on then to the safeguarding legislation, and of course it's one of the main objectives of Safeguarding Ireland is to ensure that we have an adequate framework for safeguarding very vulnerable people. I mentioned already that there's no independent authority, and we are obliged to have that independent authority under the UN Convention of the Rights of People with Disabilities. But as you know, safeguarding embraces many more people outside of the disability, you can be vulnerable. You and I can be vulnerable day to day or whatever, depending on our circumstances. So there's a large people who have capacity, who are extremely vulnerable and need protection, as well as those extremely vulnerable people who lack capacity or have other very extreme illnesses or whatever. So Tim mentioned their domestic violence legislation. I would come back to some of the figures, both UCD figures way back in 2010, and indeed the HSE figures over the years in terms of psychological abuse of older people. And I suppose the UCD study pointed out the older, the frailer, the poorer, the higher the level of abuse. So we have to take that on board. And certainly the HSE figures point out, again, the higher levels of abuse are amongst the older old. So if you take psychological abuse, it's up at 32, 36%. We updated or reformed our domestic violence legislation, which commenced on the 1st of January 2019. We introduced a new offence of coercive control. But what would we do? We limited it to those people who are or were in an intimate relationship. And yet we see that very high level of psychological abuse, undue influence and coercive control amongst older people by younger adults. So we have that huge gap. That's where we need safeguarding legislation as an all-embracing, not limited in our little silo mentalities of different areas or different departments. Another issue is the whole issue of, and I should also say about the domestic violence legislation, quite astonishingly, the HSE are not a primary agent to make applications to the court where a person needs to be protected, where a safety bar or protection order is required. That has to go through TULSA. So another major issue that needs to be addressed. So even though there is some legislation there, it's not appropriate legislation in the circumstances. And we need then both public bodies. I mean, Safeguarding Ireland was saying it's not just a health issue, it's an all-embracing society issue, and we need to understand that. The other issue that the AC case highlighted is we tend to actually put people or make decisions on their behalf where somebody else is causing or is responsible for the abuse or the risk that they're suffering. So at the moment, our response is to make an application to have somebody taken into wardship because they need protection. And of course, that's a huge infringement of rights. And of course, the AC case said, the court said that in principle, where the risk of a patient comes from a third party, it seems that it's preferable that appropriate legal measures should be directed at the persons creating the risk. So again, in terms of our adult safeguarding legislation, we need access to information, we need access and right of entry. The HSE protection and safeguarding team, they don't work on a statutory basis, and certainly they don't have a right of entry into private nursing homes. They have by consent, they get into HSE facilities, but they have no legal right. Nor do we have a legal right to enter a person who's in a very abusive situation to enter their home. So these were some of the issues that the Law Reform Commission have been looking at in terms of what's the framework we need to get that information, the right of entry, and also the whole question of the overarching independent authority that needs to be put in place. The other issue I would raise is that in terms of data sharing, again, we have data sharing legislation, we have GDPR and whatever. And here I come back to the whole question of how we interpret legislation. And everybody, when we had Data Sharing Protection and Governance Act of 2019, which provides that public bodies can share information. But where are we where there's huge financial abuse and we need to share information with banks, etc., who do not come under the definition of a public body? So again, huge gaps there. And we tend to regard financial abuse as a family matter, the right of inheritance, the right to pass assets and whatever. While we have legislation there, it's called Theft and Fraud Act, we don't seem to understand that it actually is appropriate to use it in certain circumstances. But coming back to GDPR or whatever, we use the data protection legislation as a shield of where we shouldn't give information or we need somebody's consent. Consent is one of 7 options under the legislation. The legislation and indeed the GDPR is very clear that where the vital interests of a very vulnerable person is at stake, then data can be shared. It's not limited to public bodies or private bodies or whatever. Vital interests of a person is at stake then. So again, we need guidance from the Data Protection Commission. Safeguarding Ireland is currently in communication, and we have a meeting tomorrow on this very issue with the Data Protection Commission. So all of these issues in terms of protecting people. And we've muddled along for many, many years, and we haven't critically asked ourselves, you know, why are we still at 1871 in terms of capacity legislation? And we haven't that huge shout out that actually this commencement has to be now or yesterday, not 21 or 22, you know, 2022. So we have to be really clear. And I think some of the things that COVID highlighted were some of those issues.
Yeah, I'm just on that very issue. You know, I think COVID probably has highlighted a number of issues, Patricia, that, you know, really needed to change. And if you were to pick out 1 or 2 of the things that you think have been driven for change because of COVID, what might they be?
I think what COVID, we've been talking for many, many years, the 1970s, about the model of care, and Tim mentioned this, the model of care, particularly for older people, and the model of long-term care. I think COVID highlighted that in spades, that we're actually on wrong road altogether, the wrong path. So what we need is fully one integrated system of care, long-term care, going from at home, where most people want to be, right along to different forms of housing and sheltered housing, up to where a person needs acute care, nursing home, hospital. And the other issues around that is the whole question of the statutory funding for that. So this, again, silo mentality is you get money for fair deal if you're going into a nursing home, but you don't have a statutory right to funding for any other sort of care or whatever. And we all know that there are many people that are availing of fair deal and going into a nursing home because they are isolated or lonely or frail and old. And we need, as a society, for them to live in the community and to be supported in that community. So the model of care is the one highlight, I would say, the clinical governance about that, about going back to primary care, and again, assessing the people, when people go for the flu injection, to have the conversation every year and keep an eye on people, or have clusters where there's oversight of people or vulnerable people and older people that need care and attention, and to work with that.
Yeah, I think so. And I think certainly the model of care for older people, we certainly, you know, from the disability sector have shown the limitations of the congregated set model for many years. And we don't need to spend the next 10 years debating, is this a good model for the elderly? We know it's not a good model. And we should just...
And infection control itself highlighted that point.
Yeah.
Large, you know, congregated settings. Sorry, even on that single point.
Yeah. So that's just why I brought that up. So we just need to move on that, and we should have known that from other sectors, both in mental health and the disability sector, for a very long time. So we just need to move on. So yes, so I think there are things that are hopefully will be pushed forward in a positive way for people because of COVID, despite all the negative and other issues that has happened in people's lives. But certainly I think it may have to catapult critical needed legislation in a number of areas. So thank you very much, Patricia. I'm just going to move on. We may come back with other questions that are coming into the question and answers. I'm going to move now to Louise. And Louise, there's a couple of questions also that have come in that I want to talk to you about. And they are, you know, one of them is around what you see as the main challenges in adapting your service to a remote virtual service for people with disabilities.
Thanks, Mary, and thanks everybody on the panel, and to Charlotte and the team for organising, and everyone who's joined us online today. I think for us in the National Advocacy Service, just looking back over the last few months, and I know some of our advocates are on the seminar today as well, on the webinar. The main challenge has been that adaptation, as Tim talked about, that kind of almost overnight going from a model which was one-to-one direct interaction with people to delivering something online effectively, and how much of a challenge that has been, both in terms of you know, staff support, staff morale, but also actually working with people. And I think it has worked really well for us in a lot of situations, but I think there's no doubt that the absence of the one-to-one interaction, you know, over the sustainability of this pandemic really is going to be a problem for the delivery of social care and for the delivery of advocacy. One of the things that we've identified, that we've kind of internally come to call the kind of sanitized visit, if you like. So where we've been able to get back out and meet with people, particularly with people with maybe communication differences who are non-verbal, and ordinarily we would do a lot of work in interacting and observing people to build up an understanding of them. We're now in this kind of false environment where people are PPE'd up, you can't see their faces. It's very disruptive and affects the quality of the interaction, which makes our work more complex, because we have to spend more time on these short burst visits, because the visits themselves are of a reduced time period, to understand what is going on for someone. So has been a challenge over the last number of months, and I think that's going to continue to be a challenge. And I think as well, what we have observed too is the restrictions on the visits broadly, not just in terms of my own staff not being able to visit with people, but the detrimental impact on people with disabilities and older people, and not having access to family and friends or other visitors, of which there's a whole plethora of them, of not being able to go out and about. As Patricia said, they are a deprivation of liberty, but to bring that to life, what we're talking about is people not being able to go out and do their daily business. And I know we all lived with restrictions, particularly over the initial period, and we're going back into them. But I think not to lose sight of the extra impact on people who are living in non-private dwellings, if you put it that way, because it cuts across disability, it cuts across older people. Any kind of institutional setting has brought all of those extra pieces. So it has definitely been a challenge for us. What we've also identified is an impact in terms of mental health more broadly. So particularly at the very beginning, in sort of March, April time, a lot of people with maybe long-term mental health problems suffered quite an immediate deterioration in their mental health, because of the it was almost kind of feeding into their condition, you know, in terms of all of the messages that were coming out. There was a lot of fear, it was feeding into people's own paranoid thinking, so there was a really bad impact there as well. Other impacts that we've seen is where people have returned home to live with maybe older adults as their parents, and whilst that might have been that they've been able to avail of a day service, and a lot of day services are still not open, like we've not had a resumption of services, it just hasn't happened. A lot of day services are still closed, so people are back living with their older parents, and they're really difficult domestic situations, because the setup that they had was designed around that adult with a disability having a busy day, having social interactions, and now they're back living at home. The older parents themselves may have care needs. So that gets into the space of safeguarding, and we've definitely seen an increase there, and I would concur with the issues around the absence of legislation and all of those things. And the other issues that we have seen presenting as the lack of PA supports, the lack of home supports. Some of that was people's own choice. You know, they decided at the outset that they didn't want to take the risk of someone coming into their home environment. But that over a sustained period is just not manageable for people. So I think from our point of view, from an advocacy perspective, they're all issues that have been coming up. That, you know, there's just the extent of the issues that have emerged out of this crisis are huge. And I actually think we're only at the start. I think we're only at the start of COVID. I think we have a long way to run with it. But I think in terms of the impact of people who you guys support working in social care is massive. I think we're really only at the start of that. So I think they're the kind of key issues that we've had to grapple with. And I suppose from the point of view of just supporting our own staff, that's been really challenging as well, because we've had to try to keep our staff as safe as we can. I think and what we've seen is that there's no such thing as saying a safe environment right now. So it's trying to do the best you can to make sure that it's safe for people to go out and visit others in a setting, and we can't always guarantee that. So that's really complicated our work as well. I think other things just to note too, in terms of, there were a number of people that we would be supporting over a long period of time who were due to move into new services, maybe at the start of the year. Some of those access to new settings or new homes, if you like, was expedited because maybe they wanted, there was a bit of a thrust to get people out of acute settings or out of different types of settings. And some of that has worked really well. We've had some really good successes for people where they've actually, it has been a huge benefit to them individually. But actually what we've seen is others who've moved out into the community. And because they can't access the community in the normal way, because they don't have the pieces around them to do it because of COVID restrictions, they're actually saying, was this worth it? Was I better off staying where I was? Was this the right move for me to move out of this institutional setting into sort of semi-independent living? So there's all these different things that we just didn't, we couldn't have foreseen.
Yeah, and I think as well, Louise, I think right across both the disability and health and social care sector, and even if you look at the general hospital settings, I think everybody kind of pulled up their sleeves and everybody muddled along during, the phase one of the crisis that we were in. But it is now the duration and it is the uncertainty that you are seeing, and it is the impact of all of those things. For the prolonged period of time, I think,
yeah, and it's the unknown nature of it as well. I suppose we all kind of maybe a bit naively, it feels now, looking back, March, April, thought, well, maybe 6 months, but now 6 months on, we are looking at, maybe another 12 to 24 months, and how are we going to support, whether we're advocates, whether we're social care workers, how are we going to support people to live the lives of their own choosing through all of this with all the restrictions? And it's going to be really challenging, I just wanted to say maybe just, amidst, because it can get a wee bit gloomy, some of this, it's just maybe kind of positive things to think about are like the work that the guys have done in HICWA, particularly around the standards in terms of rights-based approach and the safeguarding pieces. They're really useful. If you haven't looked at the animation they have yet, it's really helpful. And one of the things that we encourage our advocates to do is to use those as tools when they're doing the work with individuals, so that they can refer to those, and when they're talking to services, they actually refer to those standards, even though they're just guidance documents. Really, it's a really useful thing for an advocate literally to have in their back pocket to use as a tool, and I'd encourage those working directly in social care to use them in that way too. I mean, I think that's the way that they're intended, Deirdre. I think if I understand it correctly, is to people to actually refer to them and say, well, how can I apply this in my setting? How can I implement this here? And we've been working with providers to do that, and we find it really positive, because it's so clearly set out and it's easy to grapple with, so I think, just maybe like kind of positives to take out of it as well. And the other thing, just in terms of the whole piece around I suppose what COVID has shone a light on is our sort of deficiencies in our legislation and policy. If you look at the Nursing Home Expert Group report, it does highlight all of those, and there is an implementation group now formed. Now, I'm not hanging my hat on the work of implementation groups, but I do think there is a serious intent there at very senior levels to implement the report, the key recommendations, which are around the governance, particularly of nursing homes, private and voluntary nursing homes, but also in the space around advocacy, and safeguarding is in there too. So I think, we do have these gaps, we do have a lot of problems, but I think there is quite a lot of activity there. So I think it is worth, if you're an insomniac like me, have a look at that report. There's quite a lot of positives in there to take out of it, so.
I think so. I would absolutely agree. And I know one of the questions that has came to me a couple of times was, has COVID limited the ability of people working in health and social care services to facilitate autonomy and to facilitate choice of people? And I suppose what Deirdre has outlined this morning is, it is really the principles of choice. It hasn't changed the principles of choice, or the principles underpinning autonomy. They're really what's important. And I think that framework, Deirdre, that you've outlined, we should be using that during this as we live through COVID, to realise that those principles are still the same, and it's understanding the principles and applying those principles. So when people ask me that, I say probably it hasn't impacted on your ability in some ways, because the principles of autonomy and the principles of choice.
And I think what's also been good, Mary, is that there has been a lot of really excellent work, particularly around day services that closed, because a lot of staff were redeployed into contact tracing or into testing and different things, or even into residential services. But those services that were able to continue with a service delivered effectively an individualised day service. They were going to people's homes, they were doing outside socially distanced visits, they were doing outdoor activities with them on a one-to-one basis. And I'm sure some of the people in attendance today were part of that, you know, so there's been really positive examples of work. And that didn't require extra resources in terms of money or staff. It just did doing work differently, you know, so I think there are really positive things we can hang on to there. But I suppose there are other impacts that we would see as well in terms of transport for people, because, you know, there's a whole question around the safety of transport, particularly the use of buses. Taxis are now an issue as well. So people are struggling to access even like mainstream healthcare services, GP appointments, primary care. Hospital appointments are now an issue for people who are having to access those going from whatever type of residential setting. And I know that's been an issue for the public at large, but the public at large has the autonomy and the control to make a decision around it, which is removed from people in those settings. So there's a lot of problems, but I suppose there are quite a lot of solutions that are within our own grasp as well, you know. So that,
and we have to look at the risk for people and people not attending some of those critical appointments, whether healthcare appointments or other type of appointments as well. I think there has been great innovation shown and different ways, workarounds, and that's what we probably have to do. I'm just going to, in the interest of time, move on to Marie, and thank you very much, Louise, for that. I think that's very helpful. And Marie, a couple of questions that have come in really are related to the Assisted Decision Making Act. And one of them is, in the absence of the commencement of the Assisted Decision Making Capacity Act, what actions are available to support advanced care decision making during this pandemic?
I suppose Louise kind of has set the scene very nicely in relation to saying that, you know, COVID actually kind of shone the light on the areas where we needed to make improvements. And I suppose one of the areas that we saw very early on in the pandemic was the demand for ICU beds and ventilators, etc. And policy and I suppose a lot of media reporting in relation to what was happening in other countries, particularly in the UK, Italy, Spain, and Sweden, where they were looking at kind of discriminatory efforts and approaches to managing critical care, and in particular CPR. And I suppose on the back of this, rather quickly and early on in the pandemic, the conversation here in Ireland turned to the need for blanket DNAR decisions for those that had suspected COVID, and indeed COVID itself. And this caused great alarm amongst clinicians, practitioners, and indeed advocates in relation to it. And I suppose it all started on the background that CPR is an aerosol generating procedure, and there is the additional need for PPE, and that may impact on CPR, and it may impact on the outcomes of CPR. And that caused, I suppose, a further concern for clinicians. So we in our office immediately acted on this in partnership with a number of senior clinicians, NGOs, ethicists and advocates. And we developed guidance for the HSE on cardiopulmonary resuscitation and DNR decision making in the context of a pandemic. And this really didn't change a huge amount from what was in our previous national consent policy, but it did put a focus on planning ahead. And where planning ahead wasn't possible, that it focused on the past will and preference of the person in question, and what would that person have wanted in this specific situation. So it was all really geared around advanced care planning, cardiopulmonary resuscitation decision making, and making do not DNAR decisions in the context of an advanced care plan. So I suppose the policy itself was around the fundamental principles of good clinical practice. And I suppose going on then to seeing what the policy did change, it kind of reinstated what we already had in our policy, that any decisions in relation to DNAR were around, they were non-discriminatory, they shouldn't be made blanketly, they should be made on a case-by-case basis, and should take into consideration things like, you know, their past medical history, you know, not age, and I suppose some of that was around part of the decision tools that were based in other countries where frailty was given a score, existing health problems, etc., were given a score. So I suppose what the policy focused on, or attempted to focus on, was that clinical decision making should always be key, regardless of age or any other aspect.
Yeah, thank you, Marie. Yeah, absolutely, because I mean, certainly for people with disabilities, using common standard frailty tools to measure the level of frailty was fraught with difficult for this population, and I would have spoken out about them, because many people would of course score frail even though it had nothing to do with frailty. And of course the other issue often was that, you know, there was nearly a bit of hysteria around getting advanced care plans into place, and coming in perhaps to a group home where you had people, you know, who might have had problems, who were, you know, quite, you know, youngish, and having these conversations with people when they had very little conversations or were involved perhaps in how they wanted to live their lives prior to this, and then coming in with this very high level of perhaps decision making that they were asked to engage in at this time of crisis was I think stressful, both for them and also for perhaps staff caring for them. And I'm not sure if that emerged as an issue from your experience.
Yeah, certainly. I suppose the big concern was that the focus was completely on DNAR and not around the complete aspect of clinical care. And what we sought to do in our guidance was to keep the person at the centre of decision making, and that any care plan that was instituted, it was an individualised care plan. It was person centred. And I suppose the focus then became kind of around CPR, and people were a little bit angst in relation to all the aspects of CPR, and I suppose it possibly frightened individuals in relation to, you know, if I don't get CPR, I'm not going to survive, I won't be treated, and I won't get care. So there's a little bit of confusion in relation to, I suppose, what CPR is, how successful it is, and how sometimes when it is instituted inappropriately, that it isn't very successful and can cause much more pain. And I mean, if you look at the statistics in relation to CPR, out of hospital cardiac
appear to have
arrest, the statistics are not in relation to the amount of people that actually survive it. So it's, you know,
we're losing connection with Marie there slightly. Yeah.
I just turn off my video and it might improve.
Yeah, okay, yeah.
Okay, is that better?
Yeah.
So I suppose, yeah, we all know that out of hospital cardiac arrest, and this was particularly an issue for long-term care residents where blanket CPRs were being spoken about, that we tried to focus in on that care planning, and particularly advanced care planning, be instituted for people in a very transparent and open way.
And it probably in some ways capitalised on why people didn't have person-centred plans to start off with. You know, so and I think going forward it would probably, you know, would probably help to ensure that these are, like, some places have very sophisticated person-centred plans in place in some areas, but others less so, and that created, I think, its own issue. I'm not sure, Patricia, if you want to add anything to that, or Deirdre wants to come in there. Thank you very much, Marie.
Well, I think the emphasis in certainly sometimes has been on end of life rather than ongoing care and if you have an illness, and that's a big issue. Safeguarding Ireland did a survey last year, the number of people who had actually done, say, an EPA and an Advanced Healthcare Directive, and it was 2% for an Advanced Healthcare Directive, which is very, very low, and mainly older people in the higher socioeconomic groupings. We repeated some questions on that during COVID time, and while 23% had considered doing something in terms of advanced planning, only 4% had actually done it. So it had increased at least 2%. But if I can just come back, I mean, we've a European recommendation from 2014 saying that obviously European states have an obligation to campaign to ensure that older people do make and have access to and are encouraged to do their advanced planning in terms of an EPA, an enduring power of attorney and an advanced healthcare directive. And Scotland, if we compare ourselves with Scotland, they did a campaign a couple of years ago. They're up to about 60%. And one of our big difficulties for healthcare professionals is if we don't have that advanced care planning in place, how does the healthcare professional know what our will and preferences are? How do they know what our beliefs and values are or whatever? So it's very challenging if we haven't thought about those issues, and more challenging then where you have 3 or 4 family members arguing about what mum's or dad's wishes would be. So we have to get in a position that, and the Act is very clear, that one of the purposes of an Advanced Healthcare Directive is to assist healthcare professionals to know what your wishes are. So, I mean, it's a two-sided thing. So really we do need our advanced healthcare planning and really our advanced healthcare directives in terms of that consent and refusal to treatment. Really, really important. And that an issue clearly highlighted, I think, by the pandemic. And then, as Marie said, the overemphasis, if you like, on I'm in ICU and I'm going to die and whatever, rather than, you know, that conversation. So generally, I think every time somebody is interacting with a healthcare professional, be it GP level or elsewhere, there should be that encouragement. And that's what, again, if the Act was in place, that's a role the Director of Decision Support Service would be fulfilling in terms of that education and training.
Yeah, I think for me, from all of my years of experience, I suppose one of the saddest things is where you're involved in this very much emotionally charged decision making, you know, where there's just a crisis and it is very much emotionally charged and emotionally driven. And it's very distressing for everybody, for the healthcare professionals who are trying to deliver care,
yes,
as well as for families. So I say at all costs, try to avoid emotionally charged decision making. And if you can have these things made a little bit earlier, that would be good. I know Charlotte has come back. Thank you very much, Patricia, and thank you very much, Marie. I know Charlotte has come back, and we're almost finished, and I think we've had a very good discussion this morning. Charlotte, is there any questions that we haven't answered that you would like to put to the panel that have come in on the question of the chat box?
Well, thank you everybody for that. That was a fantastic discussion and some really relevant topics there. There was a couple of questions come in, but I think you've answered the majority of them. I suppose one of them was in particular, let me just pull it up here. So it was around, you were talking about technology and connecting people with technology. And the question is, has the HSE or HICWA have any plans to create an easy read module or information for service users about this, about being online and utilising technology? And is there a standardised approach, I suppose, that people could use until we see out this pandemic?
Deirdre, do you want to respond to that?
Yeah, we haven't, but it's a really interesting topic. We look at, you know, kind of, I suppose, our remit is around the health and social care services themselves and supporting them to develop guidance and to develop processes around that. So that's our main area of remit. So, you know, but we have a prioritization process where we look at all of the requests that come in from the sector. And I suppose this is something that's going to get bigger. And so we certainly, as part of that prioritization process, if it comes into us as a query, that's something that, you know, that's a consideration in that. But I think it's about services thinking about how they're going to do it as well. And I think there'll be a fantastic groundswell, to Louise's point, and to talking to people out in services. There's been an amazing groundswell around thinking about that, you know, around technology or new ways of communicating. Or, you know, I was chatting to somebody, they're saying, oh, we have to schedule visits now with family members, and it seems very clinical in some ways, you know, for people to come into residential services. And they said, in another way, though, it's really been really interesting that we can use WhatsApp and we can use all of these kind of methods to connect with families on a more ongoing basis. And then when there is a visit, it's like you or I planning a visit, you know, having somebody over to your house, or having the person isn't waiting there for the visit to happen. They've got it scheduled, it's in their diary, they've got, you know, things to plan ahead for. So I think there's been a change around communication, and it's not just the technologies, it's all methods of communication. So look, yes, we're open to hearing what the sector has to say, and you know, supporting whatever good practice we can.
Yeah, I'm not sure, Tim, if you have anything to add to that. Thank you, Deirdre.
Yeah, I think Deirdre made some very good points there. Technology is a tremendous advancement. It also brings risks and concerns. In our revision of our safeguarding policy, we've actually put a category of online abuse. I think the agencies, service providers, statutory, ourselves, the Gardaí, we need to look at kind of a joined up kind of way of how preventative, and maybe even working with the internet providers, and also good quality educational materials. We're learning as we go along. A couple of years ago, it wouldn't have been a distinct category of abuse. So it emerged quite quickly over a number of years. It's tremendous that technology is there. We need to learn about how it has also been a risk in people's lives. In a way, we actually need to get the right educative tools and the right educative approaches, because we don't want to keep people using technology correctly in their lives, because it has been empowering for lots of people.
Yeah, great. Okay, thank you. Thank you. I think it is obviously a piece of work, Deirdre, perhaps from today's meeting that will need to be perhaps looked at going forward. Yeah, indeed. Charlotte, anything else?
Yeah, there's another question in there. Do services have access to a technologist to help them draw protocols and procedures in working online?
Do you want to speak to that, Tim or Deirdre? So do services have access to procedures to help them to work online? There is.
Yeah, I mean, I think every organisation should have a data protection officer, which would kind of advise maybe in terms of sharing information and using information online. I think the question might be more in relation to users, social care workers, supporting your service users in the use of technology. So something for our organisations, I mean, we need to work with the internet providers there. Certainly as practitioners, we need to be very much minded about the rules of data sharing and protection, and what we click on and how we share information, and what we do online, and I suppose learning the new rules in many ways, you know, just be minded to it. But it's certainly a very good point, and something we need to look at more proactively.
Yeah, and I think there is guidance, particularly if you're doing guidance around telemedicine and telehealth and having consultation, and there is guidance which are issued there, which are important at a very basic level, making sure that the person is in a private place, that there's not somebody else in the room, that they can hear, that they're comfortable. Just some of the very basic principles, and there is certainly guidance, Charlotte, in terms of using.
Oh, for sure, you know, and you can send on some links to the telehealth guidance.
Marie, you want to come in
device.
there as well? Yeah, Marie, you want to come in there? Yeah.
Sorry.
There
is some guidance up on the HSE website.
Yeah,
can you hear me now?
Guidance. Yeah.
There is some guidance up. There is guidance on the HSE website from the office of the Chief Information Officer in lots of those areas that might be helpful for people.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you. That's lovely. Thanks, Marie. We are just out of time. It's now 1:30. Unless there's anything else burning, Charlotte, have we covered most things?
We've covered most things, I suppose, and it's just really to drive that safeguarding legislation for social care workers. and really get the decision-making support services up and running as well, and campaigning for that in the next budget as well, to see where that is. But just to say a big thank you to all the panelists and all the participants for staying and listening for the whole hour and a half. I know that's quite challenging as well. And thanks, Mary, for chairing today as well. Really appreciate it.
So thank you again, Charlotte, for organising this, and to Patricia and Louise and Tim and Marion and Deirdre, and particularly to Deirdre for a great presentation as well. So thank you all very much.
Deirdre, can we make the presentation available then to all the participants, Deirdre?
Yes, of course. I can send you on a version of that, or you can use that one that was up there sharing today.
Thank you.
Okay, so thank you.
Thanks everyone.
Thanks so much.
Everyone. Thank
Take
you.
care.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.